Welcome, everybody. Great to see you here. Every 2 weeks, we have a masterclass from a community member that presents a tool, a topic, an approach, just something interesting. And you can find all of the past masterclasses when you go to learn.openexo.com. There is one specific course that is called Masterclass, and I think it's about 30 of them now, where you can go back and you can watch all of the past masterclasses or the ones that you would like. So we are also recording the one of today, and it will be uploaded in there. For logistic purposes, just maybe a couple of things. It's great if you can have a camera on, even if you have your mic off, but camera on so John doesn't feel like he's talking into nowhere. And that's always very helpful. So thank you for those that have your camera on. And if you can still turn them on, it would be great. And then in terms of audio, maybe the best is to have it on mute. And we're going to have kind of a quick intro from John, then about a 30, well, actually about a half an hour presentation, 25-minute, half an hour presentation. And then we're going to have a 20-minute Q&A. So definitely during the Q&A, you can unmute yourself. But for the presentation, maybe it's best to be on mute so the line is clear and we don't have any disturbance in case you're somewhere busy or something is happening. And more and more people are coming, so welcome everybody. Great to see all of you here. I was just doing an introduction. The last thing I wanted to mention is that many of you know there is a course in the Learning Hub called Exponential Technologies, which we have actually built with generative AI tools. So if you haven't had a chance, I definitely recommend it. And also 2 weeks ago, we launched Pro Foundations. You all, or most of you might be on Pro tier as well. So there is a new course specifically for the Pro tier about applying EXO in a professional setting. It kind of summarizes actually a lot of learnings we've had over the last 5 years as an EXO community. So that's all the announcements. Welcome everybody here, and with great pleasure, I introduce to you John, who will be the speaker of today. And I'm very excited about today because yeah, facts don't convince people, they don't move people, but stories do. So I think it's actually something very, very important and often very forgotten. So I can't wait. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John for a quick intro, and then John, you can dive straight into it. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Yaroslav. And so my background, I've been a member of the community for several years now. I went through and did the EXO, the consulting and the sprint and the coaching a couple of those times with Yaroslav. So that was very useful. And but I've been doing other stuff since, and so I've actually incorporated that into the presentation. So I can just jump in, I think, without much more introduction. So today, the topic is storytelling, and I would encourage you to think of it as a type of exponential technology for changing people's minds. And today, I'm going to break the presentation down into 3 sections. The first thing, like I said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and how it is that I ended up coming here. Like, why am I talking about this? And then we're going to move into some tips that I'd like to share with you about how to tell your own story and as part of your work. And then lastly, what I want to do is connect it to some of the challenges that I see within the EXO community, and maybe we can work on this together. So just looking ahead to that third part of the presentation about some of the challenges that we're facing, I think that there might be an opportunity to tap into the abundance that we have. And I'm going to invite people to participate in a crowdsourcing exercise of us sharing what we know about storytelling and some of our own personal stories, and try to organize it in a way that might be able to help the community. Now, when I do workshops and I say that there's an exercise coming, immediately some people in the audience start to get a little bit agitated. They're concerned that they're going to be put on the spot, that they're going to be asked a question and they don't have the answer, and they start to get anxious. And that's why at the beginning of the workshops I like to share a little anecdote about when I was 4 years old. So my father was really concerned that I would drown. Like as a child, he almost drowned, and he wanted to make sure that, the same thing didn't happen to me. And so he took me to the community pool, and amongst all of these other people, he wanted to like encourage me to start swimming. And I remember I was like hanging on to the side of the pool so tight. I just like did not want to let go. And so my dad said, "Listen, all you have to do is swim to me." So he backs up and he's about 2 feet, 3 feet away. And I think, okay, I can do this. I can swim 3 feet. And so I let go and I start making my way towards him. But as soon as I let go, he starts backing away. He had tricked me. And I was so mad in the moment. I mean, I knew what was going on. He's proving to me that I can swim. But at the same time, I felt this sense of betrayal. And this happened 49 years ago, but I still have the trauma today about, thinking of this moment. And so I just want to reassure you that while I would love for people to participate in this session as much as possible, you're not going to be put on the spot. Nobody's going to be suffering any trauma as a result of today. And so the first way that I'd like to engage you is on the next slide. What I'm going to do is flip it over, have you look at it for a second, and then I'm going to flip back. And so what I'd like people to do is to just put in the chat, what's the first thing that you see? Okay, so I'll give you a second. And then put in the chat, what's the first thing that you see? Okay. So can people just take a moment and two women, a woman, two women and a skull. Okay. Woman looking in the mirror, skull and two ladies. Yeah. So we're getting the answers that you commonly see here. And I'll flip it again so people get another chance to see it. So the point here is that we are all looking at the exact same information. We all have the same evidence before us, but our brains will process it slightly differently. And we know from studies that if before showing you this picture, I told you about how terrible it is to get old, how people feel frail and are depressed, then you'd be more likely to see the skull. But on the other hand, if I told you about how wonderful it was to be young and stories about beauty, then you would have been more likely to see the woman in the mirror. And the point here is that in our brains, it's almost as though there's this switch that changes the way that we see the evidence. And when you tell people a story, you have an ability to control that switch. And sometimes, depending on the circumstance, you're going to want to tell them and have them see something different. You're going to want them to worry about the risk of not keeping up with technology and them seeing the skull. Or more likely, you'll want them to see the women of the opportunity that presents if you take advantage of these exponential technologies. So we have power as storytellers to influence the way that people interpret evidence. So let me tell you about my story and how I got here. I'm in Canada, and I worked for about 20 years in the Canadian federal government, which was a wonderful experience. But some years ago, I got the entrepreneurial itch. I wanted to go out and start my own business. And so I launched something. It was around using technology to make better decisions. And, things were going okay. But then I discovered the EXO community. I heard about all of these different technologies and how they could be working together. And I thought it was just fascinating. I saw Salim speak, and I thought he was offering a very compelling rationale for why organizations should change. But when I went out and tried to sell these ideas on my own, I had trouble. I could get an audience to listen to me, but I just wasn't connecting with them. They were very polite, but they weren't making that jump. And so over time, my business has switched and I'm focusing more just within like one of the components of an EXO organization around artificial intelligence. And with some colleagues, we provide strategic advice on integrating AI into your business. And so that's where we were focusing. But then I just got this interesting opportunity a bit out of the blue. There was a company doing training for Google engineers, helping them to better communicate with their audience. And as part of the course, it was teaching them storytelling techniques. In effect, these were engineers who were really caught up in the specifics of the technical specs of their offering that were really important, and they were trying to convey this to their non-technical audiences. And so through the course, we essentially engaged in an exercise of teaching geeks to speak. And so my main work is around AI strategy and doing the storytelling on the side. And then my partner and I land this contract with the government of Canada. They have all of these offices around the world, so mostly embassies, consulates, those sorts of things. And there's thousands of people that work at them, and they're all fighting for more resources. Everybody's always saying they're understaffed. And so how do you figure out what new resources to allocate to all of these different locations? So it's a complicated technical problem. And we worked through it with them on analyzing their data, figuring out the right algorithm to use, and presenting them with a technical solution. So great. Except those people were having trouble selling their ideas internally. And so my partner said, well, you're doing this storytelling with Google, why don't we do some of that for this client? And so we tacked on a session on storytelling. And again, it was an exercise in teaching geeks to speak. And it just helped them brief up to their management to explain what it is that they were up to and why they were doing it. And so then within the federal government community, word started to spread a little bit about some of the sessions that we were doing. Then other groups who had technical problems uh, invited me in to speak, not about the AI, not interested in that at all, but around storytelling and giving presentations. And so that's what I've been doing more and more often with clients and just helping them to incorporate storytelling into their work. So what is it that I've learned? in doing this? And what can I share with you? Well, one thing is there's a real temptation when people give presentations to just fill them up with facts. They've done all this work. These are important data points that they want to share, and they want to get them all into the presentation. So we'll see people who have a 45-minute time slot, and they want to do 45 slides, each with a new set of facts. But it's not landing with their audience. And ultimately, what a lot of our conversations come back to is that facts don't speak for themselves. It makes sense to the presenter. They have the context, but how do you present that larger context to the audience? And that's what they're struggling with. And if you think about this, as a species, most of our time was spent evolving in a pre-literate day. And so how did we share information with one another about where to hunt, or how to treat someone who was sick, or what were the rules of society? Is we would tell stories to one another. They were easy to remember and then easy to spread throughout the community. Think about what we do when we look up at the night sky is we see all of these stars. And so, in a sense, these are just data points that we're all looking at. Now, every culture on Earth looks up and sees a slightly different night sky. But what is it that every culture does is they try to give meaning to this, is they start connecting the dots. These aren't just facts, these are elements of characters, their personalities. And then we go beyond this. We create myths about them and we turn them into works of art to make it even easier for us to transmit this information from one another to one another. And this idea that facts can't do all of the work on their own gets reflected in the neurology, neuroscience of how our brains work. When we're listening to a presentation, we're engaging two small parts of the brain. And perhaps that's part of the reason that, and these parts of the brain are about processing information. And perhaps because it's only these two parts that are being activated, that we have a real tendency to forget about half the information that's been told to us within a 24-hour period. By contrast, when you tell someone a story, you're engaging all the different lobes of their brain. So it's their senses and their emotions. So when I was telling you that story about my father, you were actually seeing a picture in your mind. You're imagining me being there with him. And perhaps you're hearing the crowd or smelling the chlorine from the pool. But the main thing about that story is you're feeling some of the anxiety and frustration that I had in that moment. And there's an expression for this. It's called neural coupling. So if we were all to be hooked up and to a brain scan and see what parts of our brains are lighting up while I'm telling a story, and then compare that to what you're registering, the same parts of our brains would be lighting up. I'm able to create an artificial reality in your brain. It's like a technology for making you see a movie. Now, even after we explain this and people get comfortable with the idea that sure, storytelling can work and maybe facts aren't good enough on their own, there's still a bit of an allergic reaction to telling stories. The main thing is people don't want to tell them because they're afraid that they're going to look unserious. I know personally, I used to have this belief that stories were for children. I'm a serious person and I want to make sure that I'm sharing the relevant data in my presentations. So that's one thing, is that there's this hesitation to engage in storytelling. The other challenges that they have is that they don't know where to find stories, and even if they did, they don't really know how to tell them. Often they'll have a kernel of a story, an idea about a story, but it's not fully mapped out. And so that's why we have a template for them. And there's nothing revolutionary in this. There's lots of advice that you can get online about how to tell stories and different tips. And we've just summarized this in a way that we find works for us. And the idea is that in telling a story, people just need to know, like, what are the beats that we need to hit? What are the components of a story that I need to be able to tell? Because what we find is that people tend to concentrate on one or two of these beats and they miss others, and they'll spend too long on something and miss others. So this isn't the only way to tell a story. It's more like training wheels to get them comfortable on telling uh, all the necessary parts of the story in order to make sure that it's going to work. So let me give you an example. I can tell you about Nicholas at the beach. So his mom, Elizabeth, was an engineer at Heinz, the ketchup people, the ketchup people. And after a very demanding year, she took her husband and her boy on vacation. They went to Florida. So they went to Disneyland. And then after that, they went and had some time on the beach. So she's there, sitting in her chair, under her umbrella, just soaking up some rays, reading her book. And then her little boy, Nicholas, comes up and he's holding a plastic container. It's covered in seaweed, but she can tell it's one of hers. And he says, "Mommy, look what washed up on shore." And just think about how many more there are in the ocean. So in this moment, she's so deflated. She can see the sadness in his eyes and his concern. So she feels like the villain. There's not much she can do in the moment, but she decides when she goes back to work, she's going to change jobs. She's going to switch over to the part of the business that's focused on waste reduction. And when she goes and meets with new colleagues, she tells them the story of Nicholas at the beach. And she says, they're aware of the data. They know how much waste is being generated. But by telling this story, it's a bit like casting a spell over them. Is they can't help but seeing the data in the new way. They can't unsee the idea and the images that she's created for them. And so if we were to be filling out this template with this story, we give it a little title up top, Nicholas at the beach. So it's just a reminder of, like, what story am I talking about? Is a reference for yourself. And then here are the beats that we hit. Elizabeth was on vacation and she's feeling proud. So it's important to capture the facts, but also the emotion of the moment. So there she was on vacation. She's feeling proud. All she wanted to do was sit there and enjoy the sun. But Nicholas approached with that ketchup container. So she's got a choice to make is what is she going to do about it? She cares about her son. She cares about his future. So what is she going to do? What choice will she make? And so the result is that she decides she's going to focus on waste reduction. Again, a feeling of pride of like, now this is something that I can take constructive action. And in some of the data, it's measuring the difference in the way that colleagues react to this. They fall under a spell. And so the insight or the reason we tell the story or the moral is, they knew the story, they knew all of the data, but after hearing the story, they're not going to look at it in the same way. So that's storytelling or some aspects of it. What does this have to do with the EXO community? And going back to my personal experience, I found that people could accept the data and the use cases that were shared, but I was asking them to make a leap of faith in order to begin this process. And I think that's where I was struggling, was to get people to make that leap of faith. But even if I'd been able to get over that and find someone internally who was persuaded and thought sprint would be a good idea, they're probably going to have to get other people on board as well. They're going to have to get them to take a leap of faith as well. And so the crowdsourcing idea that I'd like to share here is that maybe there's stories amongst the community about getting people to take that leap of faith. And could we share them with one another? It's one thing to hear about what Walmart has done. It's another thing to hear something that's more like what Elizabeth has done. We can appreciate companies, but we care much more about what a specific individual does. And so, like, is there an abundance out there? Is there an interest in sharing, your stories? And so I just created a Google Doc and with a few categories of, what's the story? A little synopsis. What's the point of the story? Who would this be good for? I think it'd be nice if we could record stories because it's better to watch a presentation than just simply read the narrative. And then some contact information about anyone, like how to contact you if this was a story to see if it's a good fit. Now, it's not the only abundance that we have available to us. We now have the AI. So we have AI X. I have a client that I've been dealing with, and they're telling me about their needs, but as I'm listening to them, I think they might be a good candidate for a sprint. They haven't asked for it, but I'm thinking that might actually be the problem that they need solving. And they're an insurance. And so I was thinking about storytelling in the community. And so I just went to the chatbot, gave them a few particulars about this client. And what it came back with was, well, maybe Lemonade would be a good example of someone from the same industry facing some of the same challenges. Now, even if you don't want to participate in crowdsourcing, and you're wondering about how you could tell better stories, I did also want to connect back to the other work I do on AI, and that's suggesting that ChatGPT is a resource that's available to you. You might have a nugget of a story and you need help turning that into something more fulsome? Well, if you share your nuggets with ChatGPT and then ask it to be your storytelling coach, it can actually do a pretty decent job of it. Telling stories aligns very much with the types of activities that large language models are really good at. So you have a storytelling coach in your pocket, whether you knew it or not. And then just before wrapping up, I wanted to just cover two final questions. I'm just wondering, and you can put it in the chat, does anybody remember the percentage of information that we forget within 24 hours? And what was my dad really worried about? Probably some people remember that we forget about half of the information we've been told in 24 hours, but I think more people will remember that my dad was just worried about me drowning, and that's why he took me to the pool. So if any of this is of interest to you and you think that we're on to something, then I thought we could do a session on EXO storytelling for EXO consultants. I'd be happy to share more information over a longer format on some of the things that I've talked about here, like why stories, a little more about how the brain works and how we make decisions, the role of emotion versus reason, how to find stories, like thinking about what it is that your audience wants to hear, more about story arcs, tips about creating a movie in someone's head. And then beyond the story, there's also the role of the storyteller. How do you make the best impact? Because people will judge you on the way that you present. And how do you get over some of the nerves that you might have when it comes to making a presentation or telling a story? And then it's just a chance to practice, go through that template, see how you can do it. And then this is really important, is getting feedback from me and from the other participants to get a sense of what worked in the story and what was confusing. So if this is something that's of interest to the community, I'd be very happy to have a longer session where we might be able to crowdsource some of our ideas and work on our storytelling capabilities. But if you'd love to get a hold of me, here are my coordinates. I'm happy to share this presentation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So, Yaroslav, that
Excellent.
is everything.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you for not only presenting about stories, but also telling us some stories. That was very nice. Well done. Let's give John an applause, virtual applause. Excellent. Perfect. Great. And I think some of you were asking for slides, and John put his email there. Maybe, John, you can also paste it in the chat. So if
Oh,
any
yeah,
of
sure.
you want to connect that on the slides, you can do that. So
Absolutely.
we have about 20 minutes left, so let's take some questions, comments. The way you can ask a question is either put it in the chat or raise your Zoom hand, and then you'll line up for me and I'll call you in. So let's see if we have any questions. Maybe
Okay,
John, I can start with the first one. What is your favorite EXO related story that you find like resonates with clients and as you do your work?
well, that's part of my problem is that I'm having trouble identifying that, and that's partly why I drifted away from trying to connect with people about EXO, and then ended up just specializing more in the AI. And it was, as a result of talking about that and connecting with Lars and Fernando in another setting, the topic of storytelling came back up, and it just seemed like, oh, this was something that might be of interest to the community. So
Hmm.
I'm not the one that's been connecting. So all I can offer is the advice on what's
The
worked in
framework.
settings. Yeah.
Framework. Great. And we'll go to Jonathan in a second. One more question, John, that you had like a little, almost like a canvas or something, like a
Yeah.
template. What is that from? That looked very interesting.
That's a sort of a compilation of some of the materials that I've read on advice on how to tell stories and just put a little bit of our own spin on it. So if like what I found in storytelling material is there's a lot of people saying you should tell stories. Stories are powerful. And I thought, great. But then, so how do I do that? And that's a stumbling block. So trying to cobble together
Yeah.
some of the other material. So you'll see on that canvas, like I make a reference to like one of the stories that we're building upon, and that person made it open source. So I'm very comfortable sharing that. Yeah.
Mm, super. That's very interesting. Jonathan, over to you for your question.
Yeah, hi John. Yeah, so I'm working with Nikki on the multi-author ExO book, and
Okay.
that's a chapter for all these different ExO successes. But me, for example, I haven't got an ExO, so I imagined one and wrote about that. So I bet around the room you might have a useful conversation to discuss and write the story about the EXO that they could, would, should have in a while. So yeah, really, I'd really love to talk to you after this, and again, recommend having a chat with Nikki as well. We'd appreciate your
Super.
support. Thanks,
Very
John.
well.
Good one.
Happy to do it.
Mm, super. Andres, next question for you.
Hello.
Here we go. Hi.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful presentation. It's more like an insight than a question. So I'll just share it with you. So I have an experience, a project I am doing with a friend from Africa, and she's a storyteller. So I am very passionate about this subject. So in my experience, storytelling is obviously very powerful, and I think nothing beats a good story. It's better than logical facts and statistics. It's richer, more malleable, more effective, and more natural with the way our psychology works. So when using stories, there are no obstacles and resistance in your audience, unlike the case with logic and data. So storytelling, when you study history and our ancestors, storytelling is obviously in our DNA. So we use stories inside our minds to cope with life, to communicate with each other. So when we get anxious or afraid, it's mostly because our minds are creating stories inside our mind screen. So that's why our ancestors used stories and storytelling to transmit their values and ideals to their kids. They used it to even encode information and important data about significant places and times for them. So yeah, so I just want to share my passion and my insights about storytelling. So I am very passionate with this subject.
Mm,
Thank you, John. Thank you.
I can feel the passion. So I mean I agree with everything you say, and um and so that's where I think people get to, that they believe in the power of stories, but then like how do you tell them? And it actually takes practice. You might think that you have a story in your head, but actually saying it out loud getting feedback and refining the story so that it becomes better and better over time. It just takes practice. And so that's what we find, and that's kind of the main benefit of doing these workshops.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Maybe some of you know this, it's like a global organization called Toastmasters,
Yeah,
and they have clubs all around the world, and I can see a lot of people nodding. And I think it's a great place. I mean, they focus on public speaking, but
yeah,
sometimes it is also about stories, right? And I think what's powerful about them is that you get a lot of practice. And I think from my experience as a trainer, I've run hundreds of different trainings across my career, and sometimes when you get to repeat things, you almost like make the story better every time, and
yeah.
then you know exactly how to say it, how to change your voice when people laugh, when people don't laugh, like you know. But it requires like all of this requires practice, right? Like you kind of need to practice, and I actually think that it's extremely difficult to come up with an engaging story. It's almost like telling a good joke, and not everybody can do that. But you can definitely learn. One thing that I find helpful is some of you might know the work of Russell Brunson. Is the ClickFunnels guy. He wrote several books around funnels, but he has some very powerful kind of guidelines for how you create like marketing and sales stories, right? So two things that stick in my mind is that um, one thing that happens is that you go kind of on a journey and you become expert in something, and when you tell a story about that, you forget that your audience is maybe like 5 years behind you. They are actually at the place where you started when you didn't know nothing, right? And so one very useful tip for telling good stories is that we need to like not use a lot of jargon that we have picked up and a lot of the expert, things like I think Johnny were saying that people are missing context, but we need to go like all the way back. So that's, for example, why it's very powerful. Like if you, for example, are inspired by exponential technologies, you can tell a story when you first time find out about exponential technologies, because it's quite likely that a lot of your audience will be finding out first time from you. So if you tell a story where you find out first time, it's something that connects with them. So I think this is something to keep in mind, which I think is very powerful. And the other thing that I think is very powerful, he has this kind of a guideline where you almost like you identify what could be some obstacles that people can have in their mind. For example, like let's say you're selling a workshop, right? So you can identify like 4 or 5 key obstacles that they might want, like this is not for me, or I don't have the money, or like whatever the obstacle is. And then the way you create stories is in a way that you illustrate some other people that might have had similar challenges and how they overcome it. So you basically kind of design the stories in a way that they answer people's kind of doubts as you speak, which I think is also very powerful kind of for stories. But that's more maybe if you have a longer presentation and if you're like presenting several stories kind of in there. So I highly recommend. He wrote 3 books. For anybody interested in marketing, kind of telling stories, I highly recommend all 3 of them. Actually, don't remember the titles, but as you keep talking, I'll dig that up and I'll put it in the chat. But I think it's really good content in terms of how some of these people they come from the world of where they used to be like sending letters that you get in your inbox, like not emails, but actually you get a sales letter and you kind of read it and stuff. So they learn a lot of their craft from there, and I think they have a very powerful way um, to kind of invite people to consider what you have to offer or what you sell. So I think it's very interesting stuff. Let's take some other questions and comments.
I'll just step up and say that I really, really enjoyed that. That was a great presentation, John. Enjoy the storytelling.
Oh, thanks very much. Where's Warren County?
Halfway between Nashville and Chattanooga,
Oh, okay.
right beside Rock Island State Park.
I don't know that.
Lars, maybe may I put you on the spot a little bit? And I know that you have a lot of EXO related stories, and B, that you are very good at telling stories. So maybe what is your 1 or 2 favorite EXO related stories that kind of um, help people to understand better EXO and exponential technologies? Like what have you seen work? Because I know that you have many of them.
So if it doesn't have to be specifically on technology, I know that was just an example, but I actually have. I just want to support John's storytelling examples by giving an example. I was helping out on an ExO sprint just this morning in the energy sector, and this sprint team is preparing for the Disrupt workshop, which is tomorrow. So, but they were kind of baking a lot of slides, corporate slides, just like the one John's shared, with lots of data points on one slide. It was packed with data points all over the place. Like, what story are you trying to tell with that kind of slide, right? And I was receiving like 3 different initiatives being presented one after another with these kind of slides. I was like, right. And I was like, I didn't really engage emotionally with any of it. It was fairly good quality, but where's the story? I was really, by the way, I've heard John present the material for today last week, so I have that benefit. I was looking for the story, but then the fourth project came up and was presented to me, and it starts out with a photo of a high-rise building in flames. The thing is, somebody had been trying to charge their electric bicycle in their apartment. The battery was really worn out and caught fire and put the whole building on fire, and many people died in this fire. And this is the kickoff of a story that talks about the importance of organizing the problem of batteries for bicycles, for scooters, for cars that are being reused way beyond the life cycle, right? It's all about cost savings, and they wanted to solve this problem. And they opened that particular presentation up with a very powerful story that makes you connect right away to, like, wow, we could be living in that building, right? Or I could be the one charging my bicycle. I could be the one causing this. So it was just to totally support how John shared these, here's the data pack slide versus here's the storytelling. And to me, and I gave these 2 examples back to the presenting team to let them compare what's the difference here in these 2 ways of presenting a problem. So I hope I will see tomorrow, but I hope they took the point of the power of storytelling. I'll send them to you, John, for more consulting on that.
Super. Super.
That's excellent. I also think it shows very well, when we are pitching an idea, or like, for a startup or an initiative or an innovation initiative, etc. I think that's exactly where the stories are very powerful, especially at the beginning of that. If you have a 5-10 minutes, like, how do you actually put people in kind of the shoes of somebody using your idea very upfront, and then you can provide a lot of data afterwards. But that kind of initial capture and connect with the audience, very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super. Oderico, what about you and stories? What's your experience with stories? And
Hi, I think it's a very interesting topic, and I think that story it's everything in every business, because I think that storytelling, especially not only for product or companies, it's the basic things of any kind of business. But what I want to ask to John is this. Which part do you think of, for example, ExO model, you think is more easy to adapt to storytelling, to describe with storytelling, for example, about all the attribute or the suppose, for example, that you can create something around this kind of attributes. So, in your experience, which is the most easy attribute to describe with storytelling, and which is the most difficult?
I think probably the easiest one to do would be like engaging the community, because that's almost like by definition hearing how people get involved. But I'm actually optimistic that the storytelling could work for any one of the attributes. It really depends on the personal experience that you have. So Lars just told a story about batteries, and like I don't think that that's a particularly I wouldn't have thought that was a particularly exciting way or a topic, but these people had that experience, and just telling it in a way that really grabs the audience, I think it worked. And in tomorrow or a week from now, when I think about batteries, I'm going to think about fires in building, just because of the way Lars told it to me. So the the trick is to find some sort of personal angle to whatever story it is that we're talking about. We care about people. We care about like people that we can see and ideally name. And if you can create a situation where someone's even engaging in dialogue, so it's a main character, the hero of the story, what did she say? The more realistic that you can make that scenario, the stronger our bond with the story will be. And yeah, so it just comes down to like what your personal experience is and who you happen to know that encountered those attributes.
Hmm. I think that's great. I'm gonna hand over to Lars in a second. The other thing that I think is very powerful, or at least I find, is that when you take the 11 EXO attributes, if you have like two companies that you really like for each attribute, and you know those companies very well, and I would, for example, even like for example online, you just share a screen and you just say like, this company is using AI in this way, and this is the example. So basically, tell a story of a company, because many times people find the attributes like great, kind of an abstract,
Yeah.
but to make it concrete is very powerful, especially, for example, if you were doing it in Italy, you can find one Italian company for each attribute. They are doing it like really well. And then you can have these stories, and basically when you're presenting it to other people in Italy, you can just give examples from companies that they already know very well. And I think that's a very powerful way to apply storytelling specifically to EXO. And it's kind of fun, and it kind of creates this it kind of takes the framework that is more like kind of high level, and it kind of lands it at something very concrete, like, oh, there are all these companies that are already doing it. I find very similar, for example, I follow circular economy, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they have tons of stories of companies that are actually applying circularity in their business model. And circular economy is great. Like, they have this great diagram, it's great theoretically, but it's only when you hear those stories of the companies, like, oh, this company did this and this company did this, and this is what challenges they face. Like, when you hear those kind of stories, it just gets very real and very powerful. And also, you kind of say to yourself, like, oh, this works. It's not just abstract concept, it actually works. Companies are doing it, it's really working, so maybe I can do it. And you get a lot of inspiration from those stories. So that's, I think, like a way to apply stories specifically to EXO. In the Awake presentation, we have that canvas with all of those logos of those companies. So that's like one way to do it, but you can create your own with your own logos and your own examples that you are passionate about. And I think that's a very powerful way to do it. Lars, over to you.
Just to build on what you're talking about here, the way I've found to be really easy, really effective to find stories. I mean, don't make up stories, go find the stories. And it's simply when you're introducing somebody to an EXO attribute, ask them, how would you apply this, or how do you already apply this attribute in your business, if it's a business. And sometimes the answer is, we don't know, or we don't do it, or something else. But sometimes you get really interesting stories in response, stories that you can then tell others, just like we've heard several suggest here. I just want to, if I can quickly give one example, it's a story I've been telling for 7 years, again and again. It will never leave me. And it came by asking the top 5 executives at Black & Decker. I was invited to the headquarters of Black & Decker together with Salim to do a 2-day training. This was back in the days, probably 7 years ago or something. To train for 2 days, train the executives on exponential organizations. And then I got the exciting opportunity to tell the executives about the 11 ExO attributes. And when I got to the community and crowd attribute, I asked out in the auditorium, can you give me some examples on how you leverage your communities? And there was totally silence, complete silence. And I asked again, maybe they don't understand my Danglish or whatever, right? So I asked again, and then somebody raised her hand, and she was head of marketing, and she said, actually, we don't work with communities, but now that you are mentioning it, we have found a very large group of people. They tattoo our power tools on their arms, like all sorts of Black & Decker DeWalt power tools. They get a tattoo of these products. That's how big fans they are. I said, so have you gone talk to them? No, they had no clue what to do with these fans. And that was a brilliant segue into talking about innovation in communities, community-driven innovation, which is an abundant way of running an R&D department, even if you want it, right? So now I've got this story to tell, and I've been telling this hundreds of times, and people now get the opportunity in working with communities, and they realize we also missed out on that opportunity. Let's get started working on this. So
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think you pick up these stories over time. Maybe when you're starting, you can take the stories from research, just like learning about, listening to podcasts, learning about what stories you pick up. I think, for example, podcasts that are around entrepreneurship, there might be a lot of interesting stories of companies, what they've done. So I think you can start with that, but over time, as Lars is saying, you'll kind of build your own stories that will be even more powerful because you actually been there, even though they might have not gotten your Danglish, Danglish there. Awesome, perfect, great. I have put a link to Russell Branson's books in the chat, so you can find them there. They're all available on Kindle. Highly recommend all of them, and they have a little bit of a different focus, but all are kind of a lot of actually know-how and knowledge put into those books. So I find it very helpful. It's about marketing, but marketing is also about people, about human psychology, about influencing, about building stories and building brands and all that kind of stuff. So I think he has some very powerful things there. So we'll wrap it up here. John, thank you very much for the presentation and for a stimulating discussion we had here. And thank you everybody for contributing. I'm just putting a link to a quick feedback form. If you can spend 30 seconds after we dial off from here just to fill it in, we can then give this feedback back to John about how he did and what he can improve going forward. And let's continue building stories, sharing stories, and using stories. I think it's a very powerful medium. So very grateful, John, that you brought that in. So thank you, everybody. Great to see you all, and speak soon. See you around in the community. Have a great day.
Everybody have a great day.
Feel free to email me.
Yes.
Thank you.